Well, here then is the standard model in cognitive science of religion. Supernatural agent beliefs, right? Belief in gods, belief in spirits, belief in big gods, super gods. They arise and they persist because they're the natural outputs of innate cognitive mechanisms. When you have a mind that has agency detection as part of its toolkit, when you have a mind that has theory of mind as part of its toolkit, this ability to attribute mental states to things, this ability to attribute agency to events in the world, it's very natural to look around in your environment and say, God did that. It's very natural to see certain events in nature and say, well, God must be very angry. God must be very pleased, right? So when you have kind of a mental array like the ones that we have, belief in supernatural agents is just a natural byproduct. Religious concepts, though, are sufficiently counterintuitive that make them optimally suited for recall and transmission. So you need to have God beliefs that are, the properties that you attribute to gods have to be sufficiently like the properties you attribute to humans to make them intelligible, but they have to be sufficiently different to make them memorable. If you had a god who did exactly the same thing that human beings did, well, why would that person be a god? Or if you had a god who had properties that were so complicated and so hard to remember that you couldn't exactly remember what that god was like, those kinds of supernatural agent beliefs wouldn't persist. Religious beliefs are attributed then to be beneficial to us in our attempts to form stable and group relationships. Now, there's kind of a distinction. Most theorists within cognitive science of religion don't go so far to say as we are selected for religious beliefs, that religious beliefs themselves are adaptive and selected by natural selection to contribute to our own survival and reproduction. However, many, in fact most, would say that it turns out that religion and religious beliefs and supernatural agents do contribute to our ability to form stable group relationships. And when you're an evolving society, knowing who's on your team is helpful for you to navigate life, right? And one way to find out who's on your team is to find out who believes the same things that you do about gods. Religious beliefs also persist on the standard model because they contribute to grand stories that help us make sense of our world. They're inference-rich, and they are able to be incorporated into all sorts of rituals, which are meaningful and help us in all sorts of ways. Okay, well that's cognitive science of religion, this attempt to describe religious belief in cognitive terms that sees it as an output of certain mental tools that we have. Nowhere in that story did you find the work of God. Why is it that people believe in gods? Well, on the cognitive science approach, they're going to say people believe in gods because it's very easy for them to believe in gods, given the kind of brains that we have. As philosophers, right, whether they're, whatever their perspective on theism, but as philosophers have engaged the material that comes to us from cognitive science, and some of the inferences that are made that are supposed to follow from the science, they're asking this question, what exactly is the argument, right? Suppose you have a cognitive explanation. Suppose you have a story about what's going on cognitively when people that helps us understand why religion persists, why we find it cross-culturally, why atheism is relatively rare in human history. Right? Well, cognitive science of religion does a good job of telling us, of answering those kinds of questions. But it's a strong leap from that kind of story to the conclusion that there is no God. If there is a God who created cognitively rich creatures in his image, you might think that you would expect that those creatures would find it easy to believe in the supernatural. Right? It's not... there's a theologically informed way to nuance the cognitive science that actually makes very good theological sense. You would not think it's surprising that creatures evolve with agency detection and a theory of mind in order to make it very natural for them to accept the transcendent, to think that naturalism is false, and to accept the belief in a supernatural realm. There are lots of different ways to interpret the models that we have, and it's consistent with a naturalistic account, but also perfectly consistent with a theologically informed account of truth-aimed belief in God.